Hello, and welcome to the presentation on the ecological analogy and ecological validity. So we're going to move into a PowerPoint here, which I know is going to be extremely exciting for everyone. Everyone loves a PowerPoint. So this presentation is called An Ecological Approach to Research, Thinking Like an Ecosystem. Hopefully that phrase will make sense by the time we're through this. So the questions that I hope we can answer in this presentation are, one, why should we think ecologically about problems in living? Why should we take topics that are being hopefully worked on or even solved in multiple different ways and think about them more ecologically? Two, what is ecological validity? So there are probably other types of validity that you've heard of, maybe, and this is a different type, so we'll get into what that really means. And then how can we systematically tell if our research and action are ecologically valid? So instead of just thinking about it, how can we be more systematic about it? And what are some real-world examples? So hopefully we'll go through some real-world examples. And then I'll be asking you for some examples on the discussion board. So the first thing that we're going to do is talk through an example that was one of my exposures to this idea. And it involves a Malaysian malaria epidemic in the 1950s. And essentially what was going on is that there was this high number of malaria cases in villages. Now these are villages essentially out in rainforests, very isolated, but these malaria cases were going out there on the rise. So the action taken, the World Health Organization sprays DDT in the villages. Now at the time, what the WHO knows is that mosquitoes are carrying the malaria from one person to another, and that DDT kills those mosquitoes. Well, at the time they didn't know, as many of us know now, that DDT is horribly poisonous and terrible for the environment, so you can at least give them a little slack on that if you would like. I'm inclined not to give them too much slack. But anyway, they figured that this would take care of the problem. So, what are the results of their action? The first result is that malaria cases decline. Problem solved. So, just as they thought, you kill the mosquitoes carrying the malaria cases go down. Great. Unfortunately, many of the hut roofs in these villages start to collapse, which was not at all what they were intending to happen, as there have been no cases shown of DDT killing roofs. Then plague cases increase. All of a sudden the plague, as in the Black Death, bubonic plague, those cases increase from pretty much non-existent to almost as high as the malaria. So that's a real issue. No one wants to get rid of malaria and replace it with the plague, even just for the historical feeling of not wanting to be part of a new Black Death, I would say. So what went wrong? What went wrong with the World Health Organization spraying DDT and all of these unintended consequences happening? So the real problem is non-ecological thinking. This is my assertion and the assertion of some others. So there's this additional cast of characters involved that the World Health Organization was not paying attention to or did not spend enough time on the ground to understand were there. So we have straw-eating moth larvae. We have moth-eating wasps. We have DDT-resistant cockroaches, as most cockroaches are. We have DDT-sensitive geckos. We have cats, rats, and plague-infected fleas. So how did these actors have an effect on the well-being of villagers and their homes? That's what we're going to find out. And the way we do that is by spending a day in the life of a Malaysian ecosystem sprayed with DDT. So first, the DDT killed the moth-eating wasps, which would seem to be not the worst unintended consequence, but their favorite prey, the straw-eating moth larvae, proliferated. Then those straw-eating moths ate the roofs of the huts, causing them to collapse. They ate the connective material that was used by the villagers to keep the roofs up, so they collapsed. The cockroaches built up high levels of DDT because many of them didn't die. The geckos ate the roaches, becoming sick and slow. Then cats ate the cockroaches and they ate the geckos, and then they died from DDT poisoning. So then the rat population explodes, and then there are these free-roaming rats that are carrying plague-infected fleas into the huts and passing that plague onto the human inhabitants. So all of a sudden we see what went on, and that all of these different casts of characters all had a part to play, and that without knowing what part they played, without knowing what was going on in that ecosystem, we had no way to predict what was going to go on. So after the fact, the World Health Organization comes up with some solutions. The first one I call musical roofs. Essentially, steel replacement roofs in the rainforest make for noisy homes and tired villagers. Unfortunately, they put these a steel roof onto each hut, and when they did that, the rain in the rainforest would beat down on these roofs and make so much noise that the villagers, who were very unaccustomed to such a thing, couldn't sleep. It was extremely distracting and just made their miserable lives even more miserable. Next, they came up with new pesticides. So this was a very expensive route to go and, in the end, ineffectual. It's a technical strategy, which often people try to do, and it had really similar results. They were able to hone in a little bit on something that would kill the malaria-carrying mosquitoes and not so much all of these other creatures involved, but it didn't really work out. And then Operation Cat Drop, which is one of the RAF's most unique missions. And this is my artist's rendition. Bing! You can just imagine Fluffy coming down through the fluffy clouds and arriving in the village. Actually, honestly, they did in fact airdrop cats into the villages. Of course, they were in these safe containers. They weren't looking like little kitty commandos like I imagined them. But this was the end solution. So, lessons learned. If the final stage of your intervention involves airdropping cats, it's likely that something went very, very wrong. So this is really evidence that a lot of bad turns were taken along the way. And I promise you, you can look this up, and it really did happen, as crazy as it sounds. But the real underlying message here is that most people, even trained, experienced professionals, often do not use ecological thinking. They do not think like an ecosystem. They do not think through all of the different casts of characters because they're not trained to, and it's not sort of culturally acceptable within most disciplines and most sectors to do this. So to solve real-world problems, it's advantageous to think like an ecosystem, essentially putting yourself into the place of the system itself instead of just thinking about human inhabitants or A causes B, so therefore stop A. You have to think through it in a much more complete fashion. So how can we think ecologically about community problems? This is something that's a difficult thing to do, otherwise everyone would be doing it. So you have to think about the actors, who is involved. And this doesn't just mean people, this doesn't just mean animals, it means all kinds of elements of the environment. So then you also have levels. What system aspects are important? So you have these individual levels, you have these more structural levels, you have natural levels, all of these different things. And I'll give you a more systematic way to think about this later, but you have to think about all these multiple levels and interacting. Processes. So how are actors and levels connected? How are actors either individually, in aggregates, in groups that are acting almost like organisms? How are they all interacting with each other? And then measurement. You have to think about how you can systematically understand and change the situation. If you're not systematic about it, and if you're not measuring, then you won't know what's going on, nor will you know if you've done a good enough job in your action, and you absolutely won't be able to improve. And then looking at change. Change, I think of as being ecological input. In other words, what are all the elements of an ecology that are leading to the situation as it is? Process or intervention. So what processes are going on, or what intervention are you using to try and change the situation that's happened so far? And then what's the ecological impact? What happens afterwards? So what different levels, what actors, what processes are going to change because of the work that you're doing, both intended and unintended. So here's a real-world example. This is the ecology of homelessness. This is something that I've done research on in particular, and it's something that I use as an example because it's something that involves both sustainability, it involves the natural environment, it involves the human experience in so many different levels. So research shows that homelessness is on the rise, and the reasons for people becoming homeless have changed. So we think about in the early 1980s, there's deinstitutionalization, and people see those folks out on the street who are experiencing homelessness as likely being mentally ill, some creepy guy on his own, someone choosing to be out on the streets because they can't function in society, that sort of thing. And although sometimes that was true at the time, there were still plenty of people who were on the streets for different reasons. Over time, that's changed quite drastically. And now you have many more people who are out on the streets because of economic reasons. And I'm assuming you can understand by the housing bubble breaking and the economy plummeting in so many ways that lots of people suffered quite a bit from that. So you have this early rise in the 1980s, but then by the 1990s you find that 7.4% of people had been homeless at some point in their lives by the 90s. So in just one decade, you had gone from a very small minority of people, mostly due to deinstitutionalization, people being essentially moved out of these large mental institutions, that by the 90s it had already changed drastically. And you have a very, very high incidence. And now economic recession has swiftly changed the face of homelessness to the point that mental illness is often seen as a result of becoming homeless, not as a cause to become homeless. So here's some of the issues with researching homelessness. First of all, it's very these are people who are transient in their living situations by the very definition of being homeless. It's really difficult to research people experiencing homelessness for this reason. Still, it's such an important issue, and it's something that's touching a lot of people's lives. Even if you look in, say, the local news in Bowling Green right now, it's something that's being mentioned more. You hear more about children in the school systems who don't have a home or don't have a stable home to go back to. It's something that's affecting a lot of people. And homelessness can be better understood by thinking at each ecological system level. So when we look through these levels, I'm going to introduce you to my extremely colorful, as you can see, set of ecological levels. This is adapted from Urie Bronfenbrenner, who in 1979 wrote an article that was looking at development, human development, child development in particular, and thinking about how we couldn't think of people in a vacuum. You have to think of these kids as being affected by all kinds of different levels of ecology. And so I've taken Urie Bronfenbrenner's idea, which have had a lot of impact on a lot of different fields, and I've kind of expanded it a little bit and ironed out the terms. And so that's what I'm going to be using to introduce this to you. And we're going to go ahead and take a break from this video, and then we'll move through these system levels in the next segment.